Hello, my name is Emma Gibson and I'm with McGill University's Linguistics Department, and today I'll be presenting our research entitled The High-Fall Contour in North American English, a Case Study in Imperatives.
Before we can start discussing the high-fall contour, we will need to lay out some theoretical groundwork. Portner 2018 claims that whether the intonation of an imperative rises or falls depends on the relative strengths of the imperative. This is experimentally confirmed by Keogh et al. 2016. But what do we mean by imperative strength? Portner categorizes two types of imperatives, strong and weak imperatives. Strong imperatives resemble commands or orders. They are also used to indicate that the speaker highly values that the contents of the imperative are to be carried out. For example, in the case of sit down, don't get up until I tell you to. It doesn't seem to leave much of an option to the addressee as to whether or not they are able to sit down. Weak imperatives, on the other hand, tend to be invitations or suggestions. Unlike strong imperatives, they allow for the addressee to make a choice in whether they perform the given action, and according to Portner, indicate what the speaker predicts the addressee would prioritize. The example in this case would be, have a seat, you'll be more comfortable, uttered perhaps in a situation in which the speaker is inviting the addressee to sit down. In this case, the speaker does not try to impose their will upon the addressee, but rather offers them a potential course of action. This type of imperative, according to Portner, is more conducive to a rising intonational profile, although it does have a final fall. O'Connor and Arnold also claim that a tune, which they term the high drop, can be used to indicate an imperative is used to suggest a course of action, instead of giving an order, which resembles the contour Portner references. Similarly, a tune marked by a high-falling nuclear contour has been reported to mark repeated declaratives and imperatives. According to Bollinger, in a situation where you have to ask someone again for something and you're starting to lose your patience, you may reverse the typical falling profile of the imperative, as demonstrated in Bollinger's own example in Figure 3. O'Connor and Arnold observe a tune which they term the long jump, and when used with commands, indicates criticism that the obvious course of action hadn't been taken before. The long jump consists of a rising head from a relatively low pitch target on the first accented word and ends with a high-falling nucleus. Second, Lieberman's surprise redundancy contour also consists of a rise from an initial low pitch target to a high-falling nuclear contour, and expresses a certain degree of exasperation. The meanings of repetition, redundancy, and exasperation, at least within imperatives, seem to be closely intertwined, and despite similarities in tune, seem to act in direct contrast to the weak imperative described in Portner 2018. Repeated imperatives that are used in a strong pragmatic context are inherently stronger than their non-repeated counterpart, indicating that the speaker highly values its contents being carried out. Thus, even in the case of a repeated weak imperative, the imperative serves to indicate the speaker's investment in a particular action being carried out. In summary, stronger command-like imperatives feature a falling or downstep tune, as seen in Figure 1.
Close the window.
Weak and repeated imperatives, on the other hand, are described to be compatible with a rising tune with a final fall, in which the final pitch accent is scaled higher than any preceding accents, as shown in Figure 2,
Close the window.
and Figure 3.
Close the window.
This type of high-falling nuclear configuration has been called high fall by O'Connor and Arnold in reference to the high-falling nuclear contour that occurs in both the high drop and long jump, as described in the two previous slides. We will adopt this terminology to describe the phenomenon in the remainder of this presentation. According to O'Connor and Arnold, the primary distinction between the two uses of the high fall lies in the pre-nuclear material, with redundant and repeated imperatives featuring a low rising head, as you will see in Figure 2, whereas its weak counterpart features a higher head. Thus, the examples you see in Figure 2 and 3 are two versions of what one might expect in the data. Here's our phonological interpretation of the different tunes. High falls have what we interpret as a final upstepped H-star accent, followed by a low boundary tone. High falls are likely to be used in weak imperatives and repeated imperatives. The use of the high fall in repetitions has been claimed to involve a low start and a gradual rise toward the high pitch accent. In strong imperatives, a regular H-star pitch is used, which is scaled lower than the accent of the high fall and is typically downstepped if there is a prior accent. For our first experiment, we sought to put the contexts that have been said to elicit the highly scaled, high-falling nuclear contour to the test. This would include, as previously mentioned, contexts that would elicit a weak or suggestion-like imperative, and that would force the speaker to repeat themselves. 25 speakers of North American English were recruited to take part in this experiment. The task consisted of 8 item sets, which in turn had a strong context, a weak context, and repeated versions of both weak and strong contexts.
In order to create experimental context to test, we went back to the literature to find what components in particular distinguished weak and strong imperatives. We came to the three following distinctions. First, and most importantly, addressee versus speaker priority. Weak imperatives are uttered when an addressee is expected to prioritize the contents of the imperative, whereas strong imperatives are uttered in a context in which the speaker highly prioritizes the imperative's contents being carried out. Second, we manipulated the courses of action available to the addressee. For the weak context, one of multiple potential courses of action is presented to the addressee, whereas for the strong context, only one potential course of action is presented. In other words, in the case of the weak imperative, the speaker gives the addressee the ability to choose whether they want to comply with the imperative, whereas in a strong imperative they do not. Finally, at the end of the presented context, when leading into the target sentence, we clearly state that the speaker suggests for the weak condition, whereas in the strong condition, we use the wording to tell, to specify that in the former context, the speaker is to suggest a course of action. Here we have an entire item set, which again features a strong condition and a weak condition, with the first and second round or repeated version of each. The repeated condition always directly follows its first round counterpart. The target sentence remains the same across conditions within an item set. In this case, that would be close the window, as you can see in the top right corner. The first round strong and weak imperatives would follow their respective criteria outlined in the previous slide, whereas the repeated or second round condition would build off of its first round counterpart, indicating that some time has elapsed. For example, in the strong second round condition, we have 10 minutes later, signaling to the speaker that they are repeating themselves within a short amount of time. The experiment followed a within subjects design, thus participants ended up seeing all 32 contexts, with the first half of the experiment randomized to see either only one strong and one weak per item set. Then, in the second half, they see the other condition. So, for example, if they saw the weak context of item set 1 in the first half, then they see the strong condition of item set 1 in the second half. This is perhaps not completely indicative of how spontaneous speech would play out, therefore, in order to better understand this phenomenon, we will still need to examine natural production data in more depth. The first annotation we conducted was a perceptual annotation made using a Pratt script in which one of the authors, a native speaker of North American English, labeled each individual sound file as either the high fall, which was annotated when the final accented word contained a high-falling nuclear accent scaled higher than any earlier accents in the utterance, the low fall, which was selected when the final accented word contained a nuclear accent that was scaled lower than preceding pitch accents, and finally other, which was annotated when the tune was neither low nor high falling. Based on what we have reviewed in the literature, we would predict that the highest proportion of high falls would occur in the weak and repeated contexts. Our annotation results confirmed our hypothesis. As you can see in Figure 4, when an imperative is uttered for the first time, called first round in the plot, a high fall is more likely to occur. If it's a weak rather than a strong imperative, we also see a smaller trend in this direction in the second round. This confirms Portner's original observation. Speakers are more likely to use a high fall when they invite someone to do something, as opposed to when they order someone to do something. There were more high falls when uttered for the second time, called second round here in Figure 4. That is, a high fall is more likely when speakers have to repeat an imperative and want to convey a level of exasperation. Both of these main effects came out significant in our mixed effects logistic regression analysis. There was also a significant interaction. The difference between strong and weak mattered less in the second round. When speakers used a high fall, did they really use the same tune both for weak imperatives and for repeated imperatives? Given prior descriptions of related tunes, for example, Lieberman and Sagg's surprise redundancy contour and O'Connor and Arnold's long jump, could it be that the exasperated repeated imperatives actually start with a low pitch, while weak imperatives did not? To check for this, we looked at the difference in pitch between first word and last word in semitones. It is clear that high falls have a higher relative pitch than low falls, as would be expected, but we didn't find evidence that high falls in weak imperatives were different from high falls in repeated imperatives. Though there didn't seem to be a significant difference acoustically between conditions, we decided to put to the test whether the high fall contour was perceptually different across contexts. Therefore, we conducted a second perceptual annotation, which consisted of trying to retrieve the original context. Again, using a Pratt script, we annotated the original sound files blind to the original experimental conditions as either strong or weak, command or suggestion, and either first or second round, so whether or not it seemed to be repeated. We hypothesized that the weak and repeated high falls would be perceptually distinguishable as a means of encoding their differing and rather contradictory meanings. If they are perceptually distinguishable, we hope to be able to pinpoint an acoustic feature that helps the listener distinguish the contexts. However, if the two contexts are not distinguishable in any clear way, we can assume that the same general tune is used in both contexts. For more precise results, of course, a perceptual experiment with naive participants may be necessary. Here in Figure 6, we plotted the annotator's perception comparing the perceived context in low and high falling tunes. On the whole, this plot indicates that there does not seem to be a clear perceptual difference between weak and repeated high falls, with the majority being annotated as regular weak imperatives, regardless of whether or not they were repeated or strong. However, the slightly higher proportion of correctly annotated second round imperatives could be indicative that some difference between the two tunes does exist. We thus investigated the acoustics of the tunes annotated correctly to see if there was any clear cues. To figure out which cues were used to determine the context of the tune, we examined the acoustics of a subset of recordings that were correctly labeled. We found that second round data, regardless of imperative type or contour used, exhibited increased duration and intensity in the final word, compared to its first round counterpart. These cues were also the best predictor of correctly identifying repetition in our perceptual annotation of the original communicative intent, irrespective of which intonational tune was used. An increase in duration and intensity under repetition goes contrary to earlier findings about repetition in other contexts, which usually leads to reduction, although Klassen and Wagner 2017 show that this is not the case for the final word in all given utterances. But could it be that an increase in duration and intensity is generally used to convey exasperation and non-repetitions as well? We will put this idea to the test in a second production experiment. To test whether this duration effect, as well as potentially the high-felt contour, is also conducive to exasperation, we conducted a second production experiment. The purpose of this experiment was, ultimately, to tease apart the differences between repetition and exasperation effects. These contexts are mutually compatible in the context of imperatives and could thus equally contribute to the increased use of the high-felt contour, as well as the duration and intensity effects observed. 16 native speakers of North American English were recruited to participate in this experiment. Here we have a sample item set for Experiment 2. The 8 item sets mimic the context in Experiment 1, with some subtle changes to allow for easier comparison between them. The stimuli were presented in the same manner as in Experiment 1. For the control condition, we simply use the strong condition of the first experiment, and for the repeated control, the repeated or second round strong condition from the first experiment. For the exasperated condition, however, we made it clear in the context that the speaker or participant should be annoyed or exasperated with the imaginary addressee. In this case, we made reference to the fact that the open window was uncomfortable for others and that the speaker was annoyed by the addressee's lack of consideration. The repeated exasperated condition would follow the context set up in the first round, but like Experiment 1, with some time elapsed. Similar to Experiment 1, sound files were annotated for whether the utterance exhibited the high fall, or low fall contour, or another tune. We predict that the highest proportion of high falls would be in exasperated and repeated contexts. Unrelated to this annotation, we would also predict, as per our speculations a few slides earlier, that the duration and intensity would be higher in exasperated conditions, as we hypothesize that the lengthening of duration and intensity that appear in repeated contexts are used to highlight the speaker's exasperation. The results in Figure 9 mirrored that of Experiment 1. The highest proportion of high-fall contours occurred in the repeated condition, with no difference between exasperated and control, however at an even higher proportion than Experiment 1. There's only a small trend for an increase in the high-fall contours due to exasperation alone, whereas the repetition effect from Experiment 1 was replicated. Here we see that repetition is primarily responsible for the increase in high falls, and that exasperation, as we tested it, had little effect on tune choice. In examining the acoustics, exasperation had little to no effect on the duration and intensity of the final word. Repetition, however, did have an effect, with an overall higher duration and intensity in the repeated condition, as was observed in Experiment 1. Similar effects were observed in the first word of interest as well, though of a lower magnitude. This replicates the effect observed in Experiment 1 that utterance repetition leads to lengthening and intensifying of the final word. This is contrary to what is generally observed with repeated utterances, which are generally phonetically reduced. The lack of such quantitative effects in the exasperation condition suggests that these effects are specifically used to signal insistence and repetition. However, these results may also be a result of the nature of the context that were used to elicit the imperative. So, on to our last section of this presentation, discussion and conclusion. Our results confirm earlier observations by Portner 2018 and Keogh et al. 2016 that weak imperatives are more likely to be realized with high falls. We furthermore found a novel effect that repeated imperatives are also likely to be realized with high falls. We did not find evidence for an intonational difference between high falls used in weak imperatives and high falls used in repetitions. The only clear acoustic distinction between the two contexts was an increase in the duration and intensity of the final word, a phenomenon which occurred across tune types both on high falls and low falls. This repetition boost appears to go against earlier findings for other types of contexts where repetition leads to reduction. If indeed the same contour is used for both weak imperatives and repeated imperatives, it is not obvious what the tune might mean. These seem two very different and almost opposite kinds of things to do with an imperative. A speaker uses a weak imperative to sound polite and invite the listener to perform an action, but repeated imperatives are used to insist and demand that an action is taken. We consider the possibility that it just conveys personal investment or excitement, but the fact that it is not used to convey exasperation and is rarely used in strong imperatives seem problematic for this interpretation. The high fall contour has other uses which we are exploring in our lab, which may shed light on the exact meaning and use conditions. We speculate that the heightened duration and intensity in the repeated condition is a paralinguistic use of the effort code. The speaker says the imperative as if they thought the addressee couldn't hear them, leading to an increase in duration and intensity. We found that speakers do not employ this strategy generally to convey exasperation, but only when an imperative is actually repeated. It could also be that the boost is what happens when everything in an utterance is given, but we do not find acoustic evidence for this in the present data. We also did not find evidence for the initial low observed in the earlier literature in repetitions, although a low start could expand the pitch range and therefore also be a use of the effort code. And that is our presentation for today. Thank you for listening.